Okay, so let's dive right into this
Yeah.
really fascinating collection of material about the origins of Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you're particularly interested in this idea
Yes.
that Sri Lanka might have played a
Right.
much bigger role than what's traditionally acknowledged.
Yes. And what's really intriguing is how these sources kind of weave together like history, mythology, and even personal experiences to challenge these conventional narratives.
Yeah.
We've got some excerpts from conversations with this guy named Pasan,
Okay.
who seems to be really passionate about unearthing Sri Lanka's ancient history and spiritual connections.
I like this guy already.
He really believes that truth doesn't need marketing.
That's a powerful statement.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to go against the grain,
Right.
present what he believes to be true,
Exactly.
even if it challenges those widely accepted views.
He doesn't shy away from bold claims.
Like what?
For instance, he argues that Sinhala, the language spoken in Sri Lanka, could be the original language of Buddhist teachings.
Wow, that's a thought-provoking idea.
Yeah.
He even questions why the Tripitaka, the collection of Buddhist scriptures, would be written in Pali
Right.
if Buddhism originated in a place where Sinhala was the dominant language.
Right. Pasan points out that Pali has a strong historical presence in Sri Lanka
Okay.
and uses a script that's closely related to that ancient Brahmi script.
Oh, interesting.
He seems to be implying that there might be this,
Yeah.
missing link in our understanding of how these languages and scriptures evolve.
It makes you wonder if there's more to the story than what's typically presented
Yeah,
in our history books.
definitely.
If Sinhala was indeed the language of Buddhist teachings,
Yeah.
wouldn't that change our whole understanding of how those teachings spread
Oh, absolutely.
and were preserved?
He even suggests that the use of Pali could be evidence of historical manipulation, potentially to downplay Sri Lanka's role.
Interesting.
Now, of course, this is a controversial claim,
Sure.
and we need to really examine historical records and linguistic evidence to really understand the nuances of how these languages interacted and influenced each other.
For sure. For sure. And speaking of challenging conventional narratives,
Yeah.
he also brings up this fascinating point about the geography of the 4 sacred Buddhist sites.
Yes, the traditional sites, Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, and Kushinagar.
Mm-hmm.
They're believed to form a straight line, according to Buddhist texts.
Oh,
But when you look at them on a map of India,
yeah,
they don't actually line up that way.
that's a curious discrepancy.
Yeah.
So how does he explain this?
He suggests that these sites might align more linearly when viewed on a map of Sri Lanka.
Really?
Yeah, it's a bold claim,
Yeah.
suggesting a potential relocation or reinterpretation of these sites over time.
So he's proposing that perhaps the places we now revere as the secret sites
Yeah,
might not be the original locations
precisely.
where these events in Buddha's life took place.
And this ties into his even bigger claim
Okay.
that Buddha was not born in present-day India and Nepal,
Ah,
but in ancient Sri Lanka. He believes that ancient Sri Lanka was once part of this larger continent called Atalanka,
Atalanga.
which he links to the mythical Atlantis.
Hold on. Are we talking about a lost continent here?
We are.
That definitely takes us into the realm of alternative history.
It does, and he believes that this lost continent holds the key to understanding the true origins of Buddhism.
Okay.
He even cites the writings of the Chinese Buddhist monk Faxian, who traveled to Sri Lanka in the 5th century
Wow.
and documented seeing artifacts
Right.
associated with Buddha's life there.
That's interesting. What kind of artifacts are we talking about?
Well, he mentions things like Buddha's walking stick,
Okay.
a mark on his forehead, his sword, and his plate.
If Faxian's accounts are accurate,
Yeah,
it does raise questions about the traditional narrative
absolutely.
that all the important relics related to Buddha's life are in India.
Definitely adds another layer to the whole debate about the origins of Buddhism and
Yeah.
the role of Sri Lanka. Yeah, he's piecing together a very different picture of where and how this spiritual tradition might emerged.
He is.
Yeah.
And he doesn't stop there.
No, he doesn't.
He criticizes historians for ignoring or dismissing Ramasetu,
Right.
the land bridge between India and Sri Lanka,
Mm-hmm.
when discussing potential travel routes in ancient times.
Yeah.
Ah, the Ramasetu,
Yes.
that mythical bridge described in the Ramayana.
Exactly.
It's often depicted as a natural formation,
Right.
but some believe it was a man-made structure.
Right.
What's his take on it?
He believes that Ramasetu played a significant role in facilitating the movement of people and ideas between India and Sri Lanka,
Okay.
possibly including the transmission of Buddhist teachings.
So he sees it as a crucial piece of evidence
Yeah.
that supports his theory of a deeper connection
Right.
between these two regions in ancient times.
Exactly. He's weaving together historical accounts, mythological stories,
Yeah.
and geographical features to support his argument that Sri Lanka was this central point in the development of Buddhism.
Right. Fascinating. Of a city called Chita in India,
Mm-hmm.
which according to Buddhist scriptures is where Lumbini, traditionally considered Buddha's birthplace, was located.
Right.
He's not just saying the city is lost or its name is changed.
No.
He's claiming this city actually exists in Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm.
So right off the bat, he's suggesting a geographical shift
Uh-huh.
in our understanding, but he doesn't stop there, does he?
He does not know.
He goes on to bring up the sal trees,
Yes.
which are closely associated with the Lumbini narrative.
Right. The traditional story describes sal trees surrounding the garden where Buddha was born, but Passan argues that sal trees are native to regions near the equator,
Right.
which aligns with Sri Lanka's geography, but not Nepal's.
Right.
This is where he starts to introduce the idea that environmental details like plant life
Right.
can challenge historical assumptions.
This raises an interesting question. Could sal trees have existed in Nepal in Buddha's time, but have since disappeared due to climate change or deforestation?
It's possible.
Or is Passan suggesting a deliberate misinterpretation? Or perhaps even a relocation of the narrative itself?
It's certainly a point to consider, and it speaks to the broader question
Right.
of how much we can rely on environmental details to reconstruct historical events after all landscapes change over time.
Of course.
And what was once a defining characteristic of a location might not be present today.
Now, Passan doesn't just point fingers at inconsistencies in the traditional narrative. He also tries to build his case for Sri Lanka by highlighting evidence from Sri Lankan texts.
And this is where his arguments get pretty deep into Sri Lankan history and mythology.
Yeah.
He brings up ancient texts like the Mahavamsa, a chronicle of Sri Lankan history, claiming that it supports his argument.
He claims that the Mahavamsa, while acknowledging Buddha's connection to Sri Lanka, doesn't actually specify a geographical location for Buddha's lineage in its opening lines. He then jumps to the concept of dvipas, which means islands.
This is where the linguistic analysis comes in. Passan argues that the term Dipa is more prominently used in Sri Lankan texts to refer to specific regions within the country like Heladvipa and Nagadipa. He contrasts this with Indian texts where Dvipa usually refers to larger continental regions
Right.
in a more mythological context.
So he's suggesting that the specific use of the term dvipa
Yeah.
in relation to Buddha's lineage
Yeah.
points to a distinct Sri Lankan tradition rather than an Indian one.
Exactly. He's arguing that if you look closely at the language,
Right.
at how certain terms are used and understood within different cultural contexts, you can uncover deeper layers of meaning
Well,
that might challenge the dominant narrative.
that's fascinating. It's like he's saying, pay attention to the words,
Right.
the nuances of language,
Yeah.
because they can reveal hidden truths or alternative perspectives that we might have overlooked.
Right. And he even goes as far as suggesting that Jambudvipa, often associated with the Indian subcontinent in Buddhist cosmology, was once part of Sri Lanka.
Wait, hold on. Jambudvipa being part of Sri Lanka.
I know.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is.
What evidence does he present to support that?
He cites a British general's diary entry that mentions travel to Jambudvipa from Colombo Fort in Sri Lanka.
Interesting.
Now, this certainly requires further investigation, but it's an example of how Passan tries to connect seemingly disparate pieces of information
Right.
to build his case.
Okay, let's move on to another piece of evidence Passan uses to support his argument, the Pali language, the language in which the Tripitaka, the core Buddhist scriptures, is written.
This is where he delves into the history of languages and scripts. He argues that while there's extensive documentation of the evolution of various Indian languages and scripts,
Right.
there's a lack of a similar evolutionary path for Pali in India.
So what's he getting at here? Is he saying Pali wasn't actually an Indian language?
He's pointing out that the Pali script used in the Tripitaka is closely related to the ancient Brahmi script, which is more prevalent in Sri Lanka. He questions why India would use a script so closely associated with Sri Lanka for such a crucial religious text if it truly originated in India.
That's a good point. It's like finding a crucial historical document
Yeah.
written in a language that doesn't seem to have a clear connection to the place where it was supposedly created. It definitely raises questions about the authenticity or perhaps the transmission of the text.
Exactly. And this ties into his broader argument about Sri Lanka being the true Buddha land, the place where Buddha's teachings were originally preserved and transmitted.
Passan then shifts his focus to the physical evidence, comparing the number of ancient Buddhist temples in Sri Lanka to those found in India. He points out that Sri Lanka boasts a significantly higher number of ancient Buddhist temples compared to the relatively fewer found in India,
Right.
where Hindu temples are more prevalent.
It's an interesting observation, particularly when considering the historical context.
Yeah.
The prevalence of ancient Buddhist temples in Sri Lanka suggests a deep and long-standing connection to the religion, whereas in India, the archaeological and historical landscape reflects a more diverse religious heritage.
Right.
With Hinduism having a more prominent physical presence in terms of ancient temples, of course, this doesn't necessarily prove anything definitively, but it adds another layer to Passan's argument.
It's like he's saying, look at the physical evidence, the remnants of the past,
Yeah.
and see where the stronger Buddhist presence truly lies now up until this point. Passan's been presenting various pieces of evidence, the city name, the cell trees,
Yeah.
the linguistic analysis,
Right.
the scripts, the temples.
Right.
But he considers one particular piece of evidence to be a turning point in his own understanding.
This is where he brings up Buddha's instructions to Ananda,
Mm-hmm.
his attendant, about visiting 4 significant places related to his life and teachings.
You're talking about the 4 sacred sites,
Yes.
the place of his birth, the place of his enlightenment,
Mm-hmm.
the place where he delivered his first sermon, and the place of his passing, right?
Exactly. According to Buddhist scriptures, Buddha describes these places as being in a straight line with equal distances between them.
Right.
And this is where Passa's argument takes a fascinating turn.
He claims that this description, this straight line alignment, doesn't match the geographical layout of the traditionally recognized sites in India and Nepal, but it does align with specific locations in Sri Lanka.
That's right. He argues that if you map out these 4 sites in Sri Lanka,
Right.
they do indeed fall in a straight line with equal distances between them, just as Buddha described.
This is really intriguing. It's like a hidden geographical code that challenges the accepted narrative and points to an entirely different location for these crucial events in Buddha's life.
And that's precisely why Passan considers this piece of evidence so compelling. It's not just a linguistic nuance or a historical discrepancy. It's a geographical detail that seems to directly contradict the traditional narrative
Right.
and align with his claim for Sri Lanka.
This certainly makes you wonder if there's more to the story than we've been told, right?
Yeah.
Could it be that the true locations of these sacred sites have been lost?
Yeah.
Or intentionally obscured over time?
It's possible.
Or is there another explanation that we haven't considered yet?
These are definitely questions worth pondering.
Right.
And it highlights the importance of keeping an open mind,
Of course.
even when faced with evidence that challenges our long-held beliefs.
Sure.
After all, history is an ongoing process of discovery,
Right.
and no insights can emerge from the most unexpected places.
Now, speaking of these sacred sites, Passan goes on to challenge the traditional interpretation of what it means to visit them. He questions the common understanding of Sangvedi Upadavagan, which is
Right.
often translated as reflecting on Buddhist teachings and feeling a sense of sorrow or mourning at these sacred sites.
This is where he delves into the core principles of Buddhist teachings, specifically the emphasis on detachment and overcoming sorrow. He argues that Buddha, who taught about liberation from suffering,
Right.
wouldn't have directed his followers to dwell in sadness, especially at places meant to commemorate his life and teachings.
So he's saying that the true purpose of visiting these sites isn't to wallow in grief,
Right.
but to cultivate a deeper understanding of Buddha's teachings.
Yes.
And perhaps even to connect with his energy or essence in a more profound way.
Exactly. He suggests that the original intention of these sites might have been to create spaces for heightened awareness, insight, and mindfulness,
Right.
not to encourage attachment or sorrow.
This interpretation certainly aligns with a broader Buddhist emphasis on mindfulness and achieving liberation from suffering,
Right.
but it also raises questions about how the meaning and purpose of these sites might have been reinterpreted or perhaps even obscured over time.
That's an important point to consider. After all, the transmission of knowledge and tradition is rarely a straightforward process.
Right.
Interpretations change, meanings evolve, and sometimes the original intent gets lost or distorted along the way.
So Passan's suggesting that the true purpose of these sites might be more profound,
Yeah.
more about accessing a deeper level of awareness
Mm-hmm.
and connecting with Buddha's energy rather than simply mourning his passing.
Great. And he even compares the potential energy of these places to the energy generated by the numerous rahats, enlightened beings, who were said to have resided in Sri Lanka in ancient times.
It's a compelling image.
Yes.
A sky filled with rahats. They're a collective energy permeating the land. It makes you wonder if these sites were intentionally chosen not just for their geographical significance, but for their ability to amplify or perhaps even channel that powerful energy.
And he even hints at the possibility that the true locations and purpose of these sites might have been intentionally reinterpreted or obscured over time, perhaps to control or simplify the path to enlightenment for the masses.
Right.
It's a thought-provoking suggestion that raises questions about the historical forces that might have shaped the narrative surrounding these sacred places.
Now, he also brings up an interesting point about Buddha's final days.
Yeah.
Specifically, his decision to travel to a specific location despite his illness and pain. He believes this act was deliberate, that Buddha intentionally imprinted his energy in that place, creating a space for future generations to connect with his teachings on a deeper level.
This idea ties into the concept of sacred geography in Buddhism, the belief that certain locations hold a unique spiritual energy or resonance.
Right.
Passan is essentially suggesting that the place of Buddha's passing, especially if it's in Sri Lanka, as he claims, might be one of those incredibly potent sites.
This is quite the shift in perspective, isn't it?
Yeah.
It transforms the idea of pilgrimage from simply visiting historical sites to potentially accessing a source of spiritual energy, a place where you can tap into the essence of Buddha's teachings.
Yeah.
And perhaps even experience a heightened state of awareness.
Exactly. It moves beyond the purely historical or archaeological significance and opens up a whole other dimension of understanding these locations as potential gateways to deeper spiritual experiences.
So it seems Passan's argument hinges on the idea that Buddha's energy, his essence, is still present and accessible on Earth.
Yeah.
Particularly in Sri Lanka, he's essentially saying that these sacred sites and relics aren't just symbolic reminders of a historical figure.
Right.
They're active channels for his teachings and energy.
Right, and he even brings up the concept of atuparamibbana, the ultimate release or transcendence of all karmic imprints and attachments which Buddha is believed to have achieved at his final passing.
Right.
He suggests that these sacred sites might hold the energy of this ultimate liberation.
Allowing those who visit with awareness to connect with a frequency far beyond historical significance.
Now, that's a powerful idea, visiting these sites, not just to remember Buddha or his life, but to potentially access a state of pure liberation that he embodied.
It's a profound concept that elevates the idea of pilgrimage to a whole new level. It suggests that these sites might not just be about the past, but about tapping into an energy that can potentially transform our present and guide us towards a deeper understanding of enlightenment.
It seems like Passan is challenging us to think about these sacred sites not just as historical landmarks, but as living, breathing sources of energy that can potentially awaken our own potential for spiritual growth and liberation.
It certainly is. It challenges us to consider the possibility that these locations aren't just about historical significance, but about accessing a different level of spiritual energy and understanding.
And Passan then goes on to clarify a common misunderstanding about the term Dhatu Parinibbana. He explains that it doesn't refer to Buddha's passing, as many people think, but actually to the final dissolution of his physical remains after his 5,000-year reign.
He describes this belief that eventually all of Buddha's relics will converge at the Ruwanwilazaya Stupa in Sri Lanka, and then spontaneously combust, leaving absolutely no trace behind. Can you imagine witnessing something like that?
It would be an incredible and deeply symbolic event, wouldn't it? To think that even the physical remains of an enlightened being are ultimately subject to impermanence and dissolution, highlighting that everything is in constant flux and nothing lasts forever.
And he ties this back to his argument by saying that until this final dissolution happens, Buddha's energy remains present and accessible on Earth. Which brings us to another fascinating concept that Passan introduces, asuras.
Ah, yes. The asuras often portrayed as these powerful, sometimes defiant beings who achieve a kind of divine status, not through birthright, but through their own efforts and achievements.
It's intriguing how he links this concept to Sri Lanka, stating that its ancient inhabitants were known as asuras because of their intellectual and spiritual prowess.
He paints this picture of a culture that challenged traditional hierarchies, where individuals could rise to great heights through their own dedication and self-cultivation, much like the asuras in mythology, who achieved divine-like powers through their own efforts.
So he's drawing a parallel between the spirit of the asuras and the unique character of ancient Sri Lanka, suggesting a connection between their self-driven pursuit of power and knowledge
Right.
and Buddha's own path to enlightenment.
Exactly. He's suggesting that this asura spirit,
Right.
this drive to challenge limitations and achieve greatness through one's own efforts, might have been a key influence on Buddha's journey and teachings.
This is where he brings up the predictions made about Buddha at his birth. The prophecy that he would either become a great king, a ruler of the entire world,
Right.
or a Buddha, a spiritual leader who guides others toward enlightenment.
Right. And Passan argues that this concept of a global king, someone who rules the entire earth, is more aligned with Sri Lanka's history and the legacy of figures like Ravana.
He contrasts this with Indian narratives, which he claims don't typically feature this concept of a universal monarch. So is he implying that the prophecy itself is rooted in Sri Lankan cultural and historical context?
That's precisely his point. He's suggesting that the prediction about Buddha's future, this choice between worldly dominion and spiritual leadership,
Right.
was influenced by the existing cultural archetypes and historical figures
Right.
who embodied those ideals.
This adds a whole new layer to his argument, doesn't it?
It does.
He's not just talking about geographical locations and botanical details.
Yeah.
He's delving into the cultural and historical context.
Yes. Right. He's essentially rewriting history,
Yeah.
proposing a completely different timeline and set of influences for the development of civilizations.
He's not just tweaking the narrative.
No.
He's proposing a paradigm shift
Ah.
in how we view the past, and that kind of challenge to conventional thinking.
His approach might be unconventional, but it's undeniably captivating.
It is.
His blend of historical research, mythological interpretation, and intuitive insights creates this unique and thought-provoking narrative.
He's certainly given us, and you,
Yeah.
a lot to consider.
A lot to think about.
From language and geography to mythology and source communication,
Right.
he's presented a compelling case for re-examining what we think we know about Buddhism,
Yeah.
ancient civilizations, and Sri Lanka's role in it all.
And it's important to remember that this is just one perspective.
Right.
It's up to each individual to evaluate the evidence, consider different viewpoints, and draw their own conclusions.
This deep dive has been a journey into the realm of alternative history,
It has.
a realm where conventional narratives are challenged and new possibilities emerge.
Right.
We've explored the idea of a lost continent, ancient flying machines, and a hidden network of knowledge connecting ancient civilizations.
It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, more to discover, and more to question about our past and the origins of our beliefs.
Sri Lanka's history, mythology, and spiritual heritage are clearly far richer and more intricate than what's typically presented in textbooks.
For sure.
We encourage you to continue exploring these ideas.
Please do.
Do your own research. Keep an open mind to the possibility that the truth might be far more complex and wondrous than we ever imagined.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of Buddhism and the mysteries of Sri Lanka's past. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep exploring.